Ground beef cost 59 cents a pound in 1970, and American kitchens turned that single ingredient into an entire universe of weeknight suppers. From church potlucks to school cafeterias, these dishes fed millions and then quietly vanished. Here are 30 ground beef recipes people really ate in the early 1970s. Shipwreck casserole earned its name in Midwestern kitchens where mothers layered whatever they had into a single baking dish and hoped for the best. Raw, sliced onions on the bottom, then potatoes, then crumbled ground beef, then rice, then canned tomatoes poured over everything like a blanket. The whole thing went into the oven at 350 degrees for nearly 2 hours, while the family went about their evening. No stirring, no checking, just patience and heat. Amish and Mennonite communities across Ohio and Indiana kept versions in their handwritten recipe collections for decades, sometimes calling it 7-layer dinner. The slow bake turned raw rice tender, melted the onions into sweetness, and let the tomato juice seep through every layer until the casserole became one deeply savory thing. A full dinner, protein, starch, vegetables, from one dish and about 70 cents worth of groceries. Biscuit Impossible cheeseburger pie was the magic trick that launched 1,000 weeknight dinners. The recipe first appeared on the back of the biscuit box around 1971, and Betty Crocker promoted it through her recipe card library that same year. The impossible part was the selling point. You poured a batter of biscuit, milk, and eggs over seasoned ground beef and shredded cheddar in a pie plate, and the batter sank during baking to form its own crust. No rolling, no crimping, no pastry skills required. The filling was straightforward: browned ground beef with diced onion, a splash of Worcestershire sauce, salt and pepper. But topped with that self-forming golden crust and bubbling cheese, it looked like something that took real effort. At around 40 cents for the biscuit and 60 cents for the beef, the whole pie cost barely over $1. It became the answer to what to make when company was coming, and there was nothing in the house but hamburger. What do you do when you need to feed 12 people on $1's worth of meat? You make Calico beans. The dish got its name from the patchwork of colors: dark red kidney beans, pale butter beans, white navy beans, and pork and beans all tumbled together with browned ground beef, diced onion, and a sweet tangy sauce of brown sugar, vinegar, mustard, and ketchup. It stretched a half-pound of hamburger into a crowd-sized dish where nobody felt shortchanged. Slow baked for an hour until the top caramelized and the juices thickened, Calico beans became a potluck institution across Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Some families added bacon for smokiness. Others stirred in extra canned beans for body. It earned its place at the Fellowship Hall table by proving flavor had nothing to do with price. The smell hit you before you saw the chafing dish: sweet, tangy, faintly smoky, with a glossiness that caught the light from across the room. Grape jelly cocktail meatballs were the unlikely star of every 1970s dinner party, baby shower, and neighborhood open house. The recipe sounded absurd: 1 jar of grape jelly, 1 bottle of Heinz chili sauce, and a batch of small ground beef meatballs, all simmered until the sauce reduced into a sticky, jewel-toned glaze. The jelly melted into the chili sauce and created something neither could achieve alone: a sweet, savory coating that clung to each meatball like lacquer. Guests speared them with colored toothpicks and ate standing up, leaving purple-tinged sauce spots on paper napkins. The recipe circulated through women's magazines and community cookbooks throughout the early 70s, credited to nobody in particular because everybody seemed to already know it. They cost almost nothing and disappeared from the tray within minutes. In small towns across the Great Plains, porcupine meatballs were a Tuesday night staple that children either loved or dreaded. The name came from raw rice mixed into the ground beef before shaping. The grains poked out in tiny white spikes after simmering in tomato sauce, giving each meatball the look of a tiny, edible porcupine. The recipe survived from the Depression, when mixing rice into meat was survival rather than whimsy. But by the early 1970s, it belonged to frugal cooks who knew a cup of rice could turn 1 pound of hamburger into enough meatballs for 6. Combine the beef with rice, egg, chopped onion, salt, and pepper. Roll into balls, Brown in a skillet, then nestle them into canned tomato soup thinned with water. Covered and simmered for 45 minutes, the rice swelled, the meat stayed tender, and the sauce thickened into something rich and deeply tomatoey. Before it became cafeteria food, Johnny Marzetti had a proper origin story. Teresa Marzetti, who ran a restaurant near Ohio State University in Columbus, created the dish in the early 20th century and named it after her brother-in-law. By the 1970s, the recipe had migrated so far from its restaurant roots that most people just called it that noodle casserole. The formula was ground beef browned with onions and green peppers, stirred into cooked elbow macaroni with canned tomato sauce, then topped with shredded American cheese and baked until bubbling. School cafeterias across Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan served it by the tray, and PTA cookbooks listed it more often than almost any other main dish. What set it apart from generic hamburger noodle bakes was the green pepper. That slightly bitter crunch against soft noodles and rich meat sauce gave it a character plain casseroles lacked. At roughly 12 cents a serving in a school kitchen, it fed hundreds of children daily. Cowboy casserole carried the swagger of the American Southwest straight into suburban kitchens of the early 1970s. The dish layered browned ground beef with canned baked beans, barbecue sauce, and shredded cheddar, then crowned everything with refrigerated Pillsbury biscuit dough before the whole thing went into the oven until golden. It thrived in the Midwest and South, showing up at school cafeterias, 4-H suppers, and anywhere families gathered with big appetites and small budgets. Some versions folded in diced tomatoes or taco seasoning. Others kept it simple, just beef, beans, and biscuits, the holy trinity of weeknight survival. The biscuit top was the genius, puffing up to create a golden lid that sealed in all the smoky, beefy steam underneath. Kids tore into it without being told twice, and adults went back for seconds without apology. The story goes that Ella Mae Hartline fell in love with tostadas while living in Arizona during the 1950s, and when she moved back to Iowa, where tortillas were nearly impossible to find, she improvised. What she created, layers of crushed saltine crackers topped with seasoned ground beef, shredded lettuce, diced tomatoes, cheese, and sour cream, became known as Haystacks. And by the early 1970s, the dish had spread through Mennonite and Seventh-day Adventist church communities across the Midwest. The beauty was the assembly line. You set out bowls of each ingredient and let everyone build their own. Children loved the freedom. Adults loved that it fed 30 people with 2 pounds of hamburger and a mountain of cheap toppings. Some congregations served Haystacks so frequently that members joked they could build one in their sleep. The dish sat somewhere between taco salad and nachos, belonging to neither tradition but borrowing from both. Communal eating at its most democratic, where no two plates looked alike. When General Mills launched Hamburger Helper in August 1971, ground beef had just climbed to 66 cents a pound, and the box promised to stretch 1 pound into a meal for 5. The first flavors, beef noodle, potato stroganoff, chili tomato, hash, and rice oriental, sold so fast that within 12 months, 27% of American households had bought at least one box. But thousands of home cooks had been making their own versions from scratch for years. The homemade method was nearly identical. Brown a pound of ground beef with diced onion, stir in dry pasta, add water or broth with paprika, garlic powder, and onion salt, then simmer until the noodles absorbed the liquid and turned thick. A handful of shredded cheddar stirred in at the end finished it. The scratch version cost less and tasted better, but convenience won the decade. By 1975, the Helping Hand mascot, a 4-fingered talking glove, was as recognizable as Betty Crocker herself. Every small town in Iowa seemed to have its own version, but loose meat sandwiches trace their origin to Ye Old Tavern in Sioux City, where a cook put seasoned, crumbled ground beef on a soft bun in 1924. By 1926, the Maid-Rite chain in Muscatine had turned the concept into a franchise, and by the early 1970s, loose meat was as much a part of the Iowa landscape as cornfields and county fairs. The sandwich was deceptively simple. Ground beef browned and crumbled fine, simmered in a splash of broth with Worcestershire sauce, then spooned onto a hamburger bun with pickles, mustard, and raw onion. No sauce, no sloppy Joe sweetness, just the clean taste of well-seasoned beef. The texture was everything, loose and crumbly, falling from the bun with every bite, requiring 2 hands and a pile of napkins. At made-right locations across the Midwest, a loose meat sandwich cost around 50 cents in 1971, making it the working man's lunch that never pretended to be anything fancier than what it was. Family goulash bore almost no resemblance to the Hungarian original, but nobody in America seemed to mind. The version that appeared in the 1970s Betty Crocker cookbook called for ground beef browned with chopped onion, stirred together with cooked fine noodles, sliced celery, canned tomatoes, a half cup of catsup, and a jar of sliced mushrooms, then simmered covered for 30 to 45 minutes. It was pure Midwestern comfort, soft, tomatoey, and filling in a way that required zero culinary skill. The dish thrived because it used pantry staples that every household already owned, and it stretched a single pound of hamburger across 4 generous servings. Children who grew up eating it in the early 70s often remembered it as their favorite dinner without knowing what goulash actually was. The real beauty was the hands-off cooking. Once everything was in the skillet, you walked away and let time do the work. The aroma of green peppers softening in tomato sauce filled the kitchen with a smell that was equal parts savory and slightly sweet. And for families in the early 1970s, it meant stuffed green pepper casserole was in the oven. The original stuffed peppers required careful hollowing, blanching, and individual filling, which was more fuss than most weeknight cooks could manage. So somebody, the credit has been claimed by dozens of community cookbooks from Pennsylvania to Nebraska, had the genius idea of deconstructing the whole thing into a casserole. Diced green peppers, browned ground beef, cooked rice, canned tomato soup, and shredded cheese all went into a baking dish together, layered or stirred depending on the household. 30 minutes at 350 degrees produced the same flavors without the architecture. The casserole version fed more people, reheated better, and didn't collapse on the plate the way individual stuffed peppers always seem to. It was a perfect example of how 1970s home cooks valued practicality over presentation. Few people today remember that Rice-a-Roni, the San Francisco treat, as the jingle promised, was the backbone of countless ground beef skillets in the early 1970s. Golden Grain had been selling the boxed rice and vermicelli mix since 1958, and by the 70s, home cooks had figured out that browning a pound of ground beef and stirring it into a prepared box of beef-flavored Rice-a-Roni created a one-pan dinner in under 20 minutes. The vermicelli toasted golden in butter before the liquid went in, giving the whole dish a nutty depth that plain rice couldn't match. A can of cream of mushroom soup folded in at the end turned it into something almost luxurious, creamy and rich where the original was simple and brothy. Topped with shredded cheddar and a scattering of French's fried onions, then baked for 20 minutes, it became a casserole that families served proudly at potlucks and neighborhood suppers across suburbia. If you grew up in Minnesota, you didn't call it a casserole. You called it a hot dish, and the undisputed king of all hot dishes was the one topped with Ore-Ida tater tots. The frozen potato nuggets had been invented in 1953 at Ore-Ida's plant in Ontario, Oregon, and by the early 1970s, they had found their highest calling arranged in neat rows across the top of a baking dish filled with browned ground beef, cream of mushroom soup, and frozen mixed vegetables. The combination sounds almost too simple to work, but the oven transformed it. The soup melted into a creamy gravy that bound the beef and vegetables together, while the tater tots on top crisped into golden, crunchy crowns. Lutheran church basements across the upper Midwest served this at every potluck, funeral lunch, and Wednesday night supper. The dish required no skill beyond opening cans and browning meat, yet it delivered a satisfaction that fancier recipes couldn't touch. Minnesota claimed it so completely that the state legislature once debated naming it the official state food. When beef prices spiked during the meat crisis of 1973, jumping from 66 cents to over $1 a pound almost overnight, home cooks across the country reached for their soup pots. Hamburger soup became the answer to stretching a half-pound of ground beef into enough dinner for an entire family. The recipe appeared in both Betty Crocker and Good Housekeeping during that era, though most women learned it from their mothers rather than magazines. Brown the beef with onion, add diced potatoes, carrots, celery, canned tomatoes, and beef broth. Then simmer until the vegetables were tender and the broth had turned rich and beefy. A handful of barley or egg noodles stirred in near the end gave it body. The soup improved overnight in the refrigerator as the flavors deepened, which meant Monday's dinner became Tuesday's lunch without any extra work. It was economy cooking at its most dignified, filling, nutritious, and honest about what it was. Spanish rice with ground beef appeared in nearly every American cookbook of the early 1970s, from Betty Crocker to the spiral-bound collections sold at church bazaars. The dish had nothing to do with Spain. It was pure American invention, built on ground beef browned with diced onion and green pepper, stirred together with long-grain rice, canned tomatoes, and a dash of chili powder that gave it just enough warmth to justify the name. Minute rice made the weeknight version possible in under 30 minutes. The skillet version was the most common. Everything cooked together in one pan, the rice absorbing the tomatoey beef juices until each grain was stained red and packed with flavor. Some cooks topped it with shredded cheese. Others served it plain alongside cornbread. Either way, it delivered a filling one-pan dinner that cost less than $1 and left only one dish to wash. The sizzle of ground beef hitting a hot skillet, followed by the sharp tang of chili powder blooming in the fat. That was the opening act of Chili Mac, and it happened in school cafeterias and family kitchens alike throughout the early 1970s. Elbow macaroni, browned ground beef, canned tomatoes, kidney beans, and a heavy hand of chili seasoning came together in a single pot that bubbled away on the stove for 20 minutes. The noodles soaked up the spiced tomato broth and turned soft and deeply flavored, each piece carrying heat and richness in equal measure. Topped with shredded cheddar and a dollop of sour cream, it became the kind of meal that teenagers devoured and asked for again the next night. School lunch ladies across the country could make it in industrial quantities for pennies per serving, and the cafeteria version, served in those divided plastic trays, fed an entire generation its first taste of chili. Before fondue became a punchline about 1970s dinner parties, it was a genuine cultural phenomenon, and ground beef played a bigger role than most people remember. The Better Homes and Gardens, Fondue and Tabletop Cooking book, reprinted 9 times by 1972, included recipes for fondue bourguignon that called for cubed steak, but budget-conscious hosts quickly adapted the concept for ground beef. They shaped seasoned hamburger into small, tight balls, barely bigger than a marble, and set them beside the pot of hot oil for guests to spear with long forks and cook tableside. The sizzle and pop of each meatball hitting the oil was half the entertainment. Dipping sauces lined the table: horseradish cream, cocktail sauce, mustard, and something called zippy sauce that seemed to appear in every fondue recipe of the era. The whole production turned a pound of ground beef into an evening of entertainment. Fondue sets were the wedding gift of the decade, and for a brief, glorious stretch of the early 70s, cooking your own dinner at the table felt like the height of sophistication. In Cuban-American kitchens from Miami's Calle Ocho to Union City, New Jersey, Picadillo was the ground beef dish that carried the flavors of home across an ocean. The recipe appeared in the Time Life Foods of the World series during the early 1970s, introducing it to mainstream American audiences for the first time, but immigrant families had been making it for generations. Ground beef browned with sofrito, onion, garlic, green pepper, then simmered with tomato sauce, cumin, oregano, green olives, raisins, and sometimes capers. The sweet-savory combination confused American palates at first, but one bite usually converted the skeptics. The olives and raisins were the signature, little bursts of brine and sweetness scattered through the seasoned meat. Served over white rice with black beans alongside and fried plantains on the plate, Picadillo was a complete Cuban dinner that cost almost nothing to prepare. Long before ground beef casseroles dominated the American table, Eastern European immigrants were wrapping seasoned meat and rice inside blanched cabbage leaves and calling them dinner. cabbage rolls, known as golumki in Polish households, holubtsi in Ukrainian ones, arrived in industrial cities like Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago, and Detroit with the first waves of immigration, and by the early 1970s they had spread far beyond ethnic neighborhoods into mainstream American cooking. The filling was simple: ground beef mixed with cooked rice, diced onion, salt, pepper, and sometimes an egg to bind it, spooned onto softened cabbage leaves, rolled tight, and arranged seam down in a baking dish. Canned tomato sauce covered everything before a long, slow bake that softened the cabbage into silky tenderness and melted the flavors together. A pot of cabbage rolls fed a large family for under $2 and tasted even better reheated the following day. When payday was still 3 days away and the pantry held nothing but a quarter pound of ground beef, a little flour, and a loaf of bread, hamburger gravy over toast got the family fed. The recipe required almost no ingredients. Brown the beef in a skillet, sprinkle in flour, stir in milk, and cook until the gravy thickened into a creamy, peppery blanket that poured over toasted white bread. It was a cousin to the military's infamous creamed chipped beef, but made with hamburger instead, and families who ate it rarely called it by any formal name. It was just gravy on toast, or hamburger gravy, spoken plainly because the dish itself was plain. What it lacked in glamour it made up for in honesty. A full plate for less than 25 cents, ready in 10 minutes and warm enough to make a lean week feel survivable. Swedish meatball. Noodle bake turned the beloved cocktail party appetizer into a proper weeknight casserole, and dinner tables across the early 1970s were better for it. The meatballs themselves were seasoned with a touch of nutmeg and allspice, the Scandinavian signature that distinguished them from every other ground beef ball, then browned in butter and nestled into a baking dish over cooked egg noodles. The sauce was the heart of the thing. Cream of mushroom soup thinned with sour cream and a splash of beef broth, poured over everything before the dish went into the oven at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. The noodles absorbed the creamy gravy while the meatballs stayed tender under a bubbling surface. Women's Circle magazine and Family Circle both featured versions in the early 70s, and the recipe became a staple of the card file collections that every home cook kept in a little tin box on the counter. It sat at the crossroads of comfort and elegance, casual enough for Tuesday, impressive enough for company. The wobble was the first thing you noticed. A faint, gelatinous shimmer when the platter hit the table that told you this was not ordinary meatloaf. Jellied hamburger loaf belonged to the mid-century gelatin craze, and while the trend peaked in the 1950s and 1960s, versions still appeared in Good Housekeeping and community cookbooks well into the early 1970s. The method called for cooking a seasoned ground beef mixture, then packing it into a loaf pan with dissolved, unflavored gelatin stirred into the meat juices. Chilled overnight, the loaf sliced cleanly, each piece holding its shape on the plate with a smooth, glossy surface that regular meatloaf could never achieve. Cold-sliced hamburger loaf served on lettuce leaves with mustard and pickles became a summer supper solution when nobody wanted to heat up the kitchen. It stored beautifully, lasted days in the refrigerator, and traveled to picnics without falling apart. In the border towns of Texas and the barrios of Southern California, enchiladas had always been rolled by hand with care and patience. But suburban America in the early 1970s wanted the flavor without the fuss. Beef Enchilada Bake answered that call by layering corn tortillas with seasoned ground beef, canned enchilada sauce, and shredded cheddar in a casserole dish, no rolling required. Old El Paso had introduced canned enchilada sauce in the 1960s, and by the 70s it was a supermarket staple that made Tex-Mex accessible to cooks who had never heard of a comel. The casserole went into the oven until the cheese melted into a golden crust and the tortillas softened into the sauce, creating layers that pulled apart like savory lasagna. Topped with sour cream, sliced black olives, and shredded iceberg lettuce, it became a Friday night staple in households from Phoenix to Peoria. The dish bridged two culinary worlds, authentic enough to satisfy anyone who knew real enchiladas, easy enough for cooks who were just discovering them. Somebody at Pillsbury, or maybe it was a resourceful mother in Kansas City, figured out that if you flattened a refrigerated biscuit, wrapped it around a seasoned ground beef patty with a slice of American cheese, and baked the whole thing until golden, you had created a portable cheeseburger that children would eat without complaint. Cheeseburger stuffed biscuits appeared in the 1965 ground beef cookbook and carried right through the early 1970s as the kind of recipe that mothers clipped from magazines and taped inside kitchen cabinet doors. The biscuit dough puffed around the filling, sealing in the beef juices and melting the cheese into a gooey center. A dab of ketchup and mustard inside before sealing made them taste exactly like a drive-through burger wrapped in bread. They were perfect for packed lunches, after-school snacks, and those nights when sitting down for a formal dinner felt like too much to ask. Hamburger pie with mashed potato crust was shepherd's pie by another name, adapted for American kitchens that had ground beef in the freezer and instant potatoes in the pantry. The 1971 Betty Crocker recipe card version called for browned ground beef seasoned with onion, salt, and pepper, spread into a baking dish, topped with canned green beans or corn, then covered with a thick layer of mashed potatoes and a shower of shredded cheddar. 25 minutes in the oven turned the potatoes golden on top and the filling bubbly underneath. The dish required exactly 1 skillet and 1 baking dish, which made cleanup almost as appealing as the meal itself. Families who had grown up on British-style shepherd's pie in the Northeast adapted it with American convenience products: instant mashed potato flakes, canned vegetables, pre-shredded cheese, transforming a labor-intensive classic into a 30-minute weeknight dinner that nobody would have confused with its elegant ancestor, and nobody cared. Every decade has its pantry raid casserole, and in the early 1970s, beef and noodle bake held that title. The recipe asked for 5 ingredients that cost almost nothing: ground beef, egg noodles, a can of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup, a cup of sour cream, and shredded cheddar cheese. Brown the beef, cook the noodles, stir everything together with the soup and sour cream, pour into a greased baking dish, top with cheese, and bake for 25 minutes. The cream of mushroom soup did the work of a from-scratch sauce, binding everything into a creamy, cohesive mass that children ate without picking through. Campbell's marketed its condensed soups aggressively as cooking ingredients throughout the era, and this casserole was living proof that the strategy worked. Simple, cheap, and endlessly repeatable, it showed up every week in kitchens that couldn't afford to get creative. Sweet pineapple, sticky sauce, and the bright pop of green bell pepper against deep brown meatballs. Hawaiian meatballs were a feast for the eyes before they ever reached the plate. The tiki culture craze of the 1960s had primed American appetites for anything with a Polynesian flavor, and by the early 1970s, this recipe had migrated from luau-themed parties into everyday weeknight rotations. Ground beef meatballs were browned, then simmered in a sauce built from canned pineapple chunks with their juice, soy sauce, brown sugar, vinegar, and a slurry of cornstarch that thickened everything into a glossy, sweet and sour glaze. Chunks of green pepper and sometimes water chestnuts added crunch. Served over a mound of steamed white rice, the dish looked tropical and tasted like a vacation from the usual hamburger routine. Recipe cards from the era often listed it under company dinners. It was considered fancy enough to serve guests, though it cost barely more than $1 to prepare. The invention was pure Texas ingenuity. Split open a single serving bag of Fritos, spoon in seasoned ground beef, pile on cheese, sour cream, lettuce, and tomato, and eat the whole thing with a spoon right out of the bag. Spoon tacos went by a dozen names: Frito pie, walking tacos, taco in a bag, depending on which part of the country you stood in, but the concept was identical everywhere. By the early 1970s, school cafeterias and Little League concession stands had adopted it as the ultimate no-plate, no-fork meal. The Fritos soaked up the warm beef juices and softened just enough to meld with the toppings, creating a salty, crunchy, messy experience that no proper taco could replicate. Some origin stories trace it to a Woolworth's lunch counter in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where a woman named Teresa Hernandez sold them for $0.25 apiece out of the snack-sized bags. Wherever it started, it spread everywhere, proof that the best American food often comes from the least formal places. Long before smash burgers and gourmet patties, there was the patty melt. Born in the diners and greasy spoons of mid-century Los Angeles, most often credited to tiny Naylor's drive-in restaurants of the 1950s. By the early 1970s, it had become a lunchtime standard in roadside diners from coast to coast. The formula never varied: a thin ground beef patty griddled until the edges crisped, laid on dark rye bread with caramelized onions and a slice of Swiss cheese, then pressed flat on the griddle until the bread toasted and the cheese melted into long, golden strings. It was a burger and a grilled cheese merged into one, and the rye bread gave it a depth that a plain hamburger bun could never deliver. Diners charged about 75 cents for one in 1972, served alongside a pickle spear and a handful of chips. It never needed reinventing, just a hot griddle and a patient hand. Stuffed prune meatballs are a really good example of sweet-savory cooking. This was something you would see commonly throughout both Europe and America, and that was doubly true if we're talking about the 19th and 20th centuries. This was a dish that was a mix of prunes with one of three different kinds of meats. People would either use beef, pork, or veal. And after the meat had been softened to the point it could be shaped and pressed into a meatball, prunes would be stuffed inside them. Some people were a bit freakier than others and would shove an entire prune up there, but some would chop it first. While this might seem like an innovative idea, it's actually not all that new. Dried fruit and meat combinations, especially sweet and savory ones, are really old ideas. They go back all the way to several different cultures present in Europe. You'll find them in Scandinavian, British, Jewish, and German cultures, and if you go on over to Asia, you will still find many sweet and savory combinations. This was a dish that did really well in the 20th century, especially whenever there were Jewish holidays, but over time, the American palate started to settle down with what was familiar instead of stuff like this. It couldn't really last and compete with regular meatballs. Frybread beef sliders were the secret weapon at backyard parties before sliders even became a restaurant thing. Imagine little puffs of fresh fry bread, split in half, stacked high with juicy ground beef, seasoned with a wild mix of herbs, and just enough kick to make you take notice. These were not your fancy brioche bun sliders either. They had a rustic, crispy bite that somehow made the beef taste even beefier. Toss on a dollop of smoky sauce or a handful of pickled onions if you were feeling fancy, but honestly, nothing beat the classic. Beef, fry bread, and maybe a thin slice of tomato if it was growing in the garden. It was the kind of food that got you running back to the table before the adults could claim the last one. You might think nothing could top biting into one of those crispy, steamy little bundles, but the next dish might just prove otherwise. Hamburger spoon-bread casserole was as southern as sitting on a porch swing with a glass of sweet tea, and it brought all the heartwarming charm you would expect from something served at a 1940s church supper. Spoon-bread, for the uninitiated, is not exactly bread and not quite pudding. It is somewhere in between. It is soft, warm, and creamy, like cornbread that has decided to ditch its edges and just melt in your mouth. Now imagine that heavenly texture layered over seasoned ground beef. The beef underneath was usually cooked with onions, garlic, and a dash of pepper or hot sauce. This dish was a hug in a casserole dish, soft, savory, and so filling you might not need anything else on the plate. It was also one of those recipes that always tasted better the next day if there were leftovers at all. But if this feels too soft and cozy for your taste, let us head into something born straight from scarcity and grit. Hamburger upside-down pie is really one that's for people who like to experiment with their food. It has a lot of practical thought put into it, but somebody clearly had a lot of fun making this. You take ground beef, and then you take the concept of a baked pie, and what do you get when you mix those two together? A layer of seasoned ground beef packed beautifully at the bottom of a baking dish, laden with onions, tomato sauce, biscuit crumbs, and a cornbread topping. This pie would be baked and then flipped upside down so the bottom layer of beef was the first thing you had, and it was filling enough to feed your entire family and then some. This dish was a part of resourceful home cooking, and it makes me agree with something I saw earlier. It said that being bored is actually good for you because it brings out your creativity. I think that people had so little to work with in these times that they were for once thinking genuinely outside of the box, and sometimes that led to some actual eureka moments, and other times it was fun, little interactive dishes like this. While it wasn't remembered much, it was still a pretty convenient meal that you could even freeze for later if you weren't feeling like eating it all in one go. Understandably, because this is a behemoth to take down on your own. If you're a fan of retro cooking, though, this is a good place to start. Reservation-style ground beef and wild onion tacos were the kind of everyday magic that kept folks smiling even when times were tight. Ground beef was stretched thin, seasoned with salt, pepper, and whatever wild onions could be foraged nearby. If you have never tasted wild onions, you are missing out. They hit somewhere between a chive and a spring onion, with this bold, peppery snap that made plain beef sing like a church choir. Wrapped up in soft tortillas or sometimes even more fry bread, they were simple, satisfying, and straight from the heart. This was not a meal that needed fancy cheese or salsa piled a mile high. It was pure, straight-talking flavor that left you licking your fingers and hoping there was just one more taco hiding somewhere on the plate. Now, if you think beef and onions are a match made in heaven, wait until you taste how a little bit of sage could turn a beef patty into something unforgettable. Beef macaroni loaf was what happened when mid-century homemakers got bored of plain old meatloaf and decided to shake things up, just a little. At first glance, it looked like the usual mix of ground beef, breadcrumbs, and seasoning. But inside, hiding like a delicious surprise, was elbow macaroni, cooked just shy of tender and folded right into the mix. Some versions even swapped out breadcrumbs entirely and used the pasta as the binder. Then came the tomato soup, poured in for moisture, color, and that unmistakable tangy sweet kick that Campbell's fans know all too well. The result was dense, hearty, and oddly elegant, like meatloaf had finally grown up and gotten a little flair. And because macaroni stretched the meat further, it was perfect for feeding bigger families on a budget. But for folks who wanted a more southern touch, the next dish took cornbread to places it had never gone before. In the 1960s, there was a rising demand for all sorts of experimentative casserole recipes. One of those happened to beef and peanut butter casseroles, and before you exit the video, hear me out. Beef and peanut butter casserole is a fascinating example of how people can get really creative when the stakes are high. This is a dish that has its roots in Great Depression thrifting and ingenuity. If you think it sounds really unusual, you're right, but you're also probably only thinking about this from a flavor perspective instead of what it can do for your body. Most people realized that the protein potential of this was off the charts. It combined peanut butter, which was already carrying loads of the stuff with beef, and it was a meal that could be stretched out to feed an entire family. Plus, despite how we regularly associate peanut butter with sweeter confections, it's actually been something that's constantly thrown into savory recipes too. This was a casserole that emerged all the way in the 1930s or 1940s, but peaked in the 60s. And this was because it was only in those early decades that peanut butter even began to be commonly available in most people's homes. It's got a lot in common with some Thai peanut beef dishes too. Crispy corn cakes. Stuffed with seasoned beef were one of those foods you could smell cooking before you even stepped into the event. Little golden discs sizzling in big iron skillets, stuffed to the brim with ground beef seasoned with paprika, onions, and a pinch of chili powder if you wanted to wake up your taste buds. The outside was crunchy and golden, the inside savory and juicy. It was a dance of textures that made you keep reaching for just one more. The trick was to keep the corn cakes thin enough that they crisped up, but thick enough to hold all that seasoned beef inside without falling apart. At powwows and fairs, you would see kids running around with one in each hand, faces smeared with beefy goodness, while the elders sat back and nodded approvingly. It was simple, it was satisfying, and it was the perfect food for big gatherings where nobody had time for forks and knives. And if you think crispy stuffed corn cakes sound irresistible, wait until you pull up a camp chair and hear about the kind of chili that made starry nights and crackling fires taste even better. Coca-Cola beef skillet might sound like something dreamed up at a county fair food stand, But back in the 1960s, it was a weeknight marvel. You took a skillet, browned up a pound of ground beef with onions, added a healthy squeeze of ketchup, and then, here's the twist, poured in a splash of Coca-Cola. That was the secret sauce. The soda added a surprising depth, a sticky sweetness that balanced the tang of the ketchup and rounded out the beefy base. It cooked down into something thick and glossy, like a glaze that made every bite feel more indulgent than it had any right to be. Kids went wild for it, and parents loved that it took maybe 15 minutes to get on the table. Coca-Cola beef skillet was the edible proof that the best meals often come from a bit of whimsy and whatever is sitting in the fridge door. And if pasta was your pantry fallback, then the next recipe might just be your new meatloaf obsession. Beef fudge is almost everything it sounds like. It's a fascinating historical recipe that's almost a bit surprising to hear when you first learn about it. For the medieval period, though, it made a lot of sense. It's not really like the chocolate fudge sundaes we're used to today. Beef fudge was a wartime dish that used animal fat like tallow or ground beef that had been very finely made to make a sweet treat. Now, how did it do that? Well, they put in cocoa powder, sugar, blended the meat with honey and nuts, and had warm spices thrown in there, which were typically always used for more sweet dishes. In execution, it felt like a hybrid between the texture of a traditional fudge and the flavor notes of pemmican. Still, this dish didn't last. By the middle of the 20th century, sweetly flavored meat desserts just weren't doing well. It wasn't appealing, especially as people began to explore more and more of European and French cuisine, becoming obsessed with trying new wine-based wonders in their food. Eventually, beef fudge faded very much into obscurity, but it's definitely one of those things that's very interesting and fun to make every once in a while. The good thing about the fudge was that it could be made using whatever sweet flavors you would like. Sage-infused ground beef patties might sound like something you would find in a fancy restaurant today, but back then, it was just another stroke of pure homegrown genius. Sage was everywhere in the right parts of the country, and it did not cost a dime to pick some fresh sprigs. Mixed into ground beef with a little salt and a whole lot of care, the result was a smoky, savory patty that smelled so good cooking, you would swear it could make a grown man cry. Fried up in an old cast iron pan until the edges were crispy and the middle stayed juicy, these patties were tossed onto plates with a scoop of beans, maybe some fried potatoes if you were lucky. They were not just filling, they were soul-satisfying. And once you tasted beef lifted up by wild sage, you would wonder why anyone ever bothered with plain salt and pepper again. Speaking of dishes that hit you right in the comfort zone, the next one was a staple at tables that needed stretching a meal just a little bit farther. Chow mein hot dish was a Midwestern potluck legend. It walked into the room carrying the scent of soy sauce and sizzling beef and left behind nothing but an empty casserole dish and a few requests for the recipe. Born sometime between post-war optimism and the suburban casserole boom, this dish took inspiration from Chinese-American takeout and made it its own. Ground beef was browned with chopped onions and celery, then mixed with a savory sauce, usually soy sauce and a can of cream of mushroom soup. That combination might sound odd, but it made everything come together with a velvety, umami-heavy punch. But the real fun started when you dumped a whole can of crunchy chow mein noodles right on top before baking. But if that flavor combination sounds bold, buckle up, because the next dish on this forgotten road trip adds soda to the skillet and somehow makes it work. Banana meatloaf is an incredibly practical recipe that emerged from times where frugality was almost as much of a virtue as cleanliness. Rationing, resourcefulness, and economic hardship were how everyone was getting by. And this was only more true during the worst parts of the Great Depression and World War II. Home cooks were forced to work with very few ingredients, and the typical banana meatloaf recipe was something that was very bare bones and required little prep work or elaborate lists of ingredients to create. All you needed for this was pork mixed with mashed ripe bananas. Throw in some breadcrumbs, which could be repurposed from stale bread, onions, which most people were already stocking up on or growing, and basic seasonings like pepper, nutmeg, and salt, and you had yourself a pretty all-right dish. The banana worked as a binder and a natural sweetener, and it would often work really well with Worcestershire sauce, believe it or not. It helped balance out the incredible sweetness of ripe bananas. This dish did particularly well in Hawaii, where it was appreciated for blending in with already existing preferences. Smothered ground. Beef and hominy was the kind of meal that did not just fill your plate, it filled your soul. Ground beef cooked slow and easy, seasoned with just enough spice to keep things interesting, and then tossed together with hominy so tender it almost melted in your mouth. If you have never had hominy before, just picture corn but bigger, puffier, and somehow even more satisfying. When the juices from the beef soaked into every kernel, you got a dish that was buttery, savory, and rich enough to carry you through an entire winter's night. Families back then knew that when you needed a dinner that would power you through long days and longer nights, this was it. It was not fancy food, but it was food that made you feel like you were winning at life, even when the cupboards were looking bare. Now, if you thought beef and hominy could turn a plain night into something unforgettable, get ready to bite into a dish that brought every powwow to life with a little bit of crunch and a whole lot of heart. Beef birds, sometimes called mock steak rolls, were the kind of food that made you feel like you were having a fancy dinner, even if the meat came from the budget bin. The idea was simple but genius. Take seasoned ground beef, flatten it out like you are making an edible canvas, roll it up with stuffing or sometimes chopped onions inside, then tie or skewer it like it is some French roast on Sunday dinner. These little bundles were browned in a pan and sometimes finished in gravy, soaking up every bit of flavor like they had been waiting all day for it. The texture was soft, the taste was rich, and the presentation, well, that part made you feel like you were dining at a place that had real cloth napkins. They were a perfect disguise for humble ingredients. And just when you think the American kitchen could not get more inventive, along came a dish that turned ground beef into a noodle-topped flavor bomb with a crunchy surprise. Beef and cottage cheese loaf is a practical dish packed full of protein that was almost ideal for the lifestyle of the average American in the middle of the 20th century. It's not something you find anymore, but it was an ingenious way to stretch out your ground beef stock further while still making something delicious out of it. Plus, this is one of the few cases where you see what cheese can really do for a dish, besides just being a really nice topping. The moisture, texture, and nutritional value went up considerably thanks to the combination, and while it may seem pretty standard today, I mean, beef and cheese, really? It was actually something that was challenging norms back in the day. It made perfect sense when you placed it in the context of wartime rationing. Unlike a typical meatloaf, this used curds of cottage cheese to help keep the dish bonded together. It was a perfect meal for large families or people who were expecting more and more additions to theirs, and as you know, that was a lot of people back then. Ground beef and heirloom. Bean chili was not just a dinner, it was a memory in a bowl. Picture a heavy pot hanging over a campfire filled with ground beef simmering alongside a rainbow of heirloom beans. Pinto beans, black beans, cranberry beans, all the ones your grandmother insisted were better than anything from a can. The beef gave it depth, the beans gave it body, and a handful of crushed wild herbs gave it a smoky aroma that floated through the night air. It was not the tongue-searing chili you find at competitions today either. This was smooth, mellow, and rich, made to be eaten with big hunks of bread or scooped right out of the pot with a wooden spoon. After a long day of work or a night under the stars, nothing tasted better. If you were lucky, there was always a second pot heating up for breakfast too, because good chili was not something you left behind. Now, if you thought a pot of campfire chili could make a night unforgettable, just wait until you see how a little cedar smoke could turn plain beef into backyard magic. Rag mop casserole was not just a recipe. It was a reflection of how weirdly wonderful American kitchens could be in the 1950s. Inspired by the popular novelty song of the same name, this dish felt like someone took everything comforting about a weeknight dinner and tossed it in a baking dish on a dare. It all started with ground beef, browned and seasoned in a skillet, then layered with canned spaghetti. You know, the kind drowning in that slightly sweet tomato sauce, and finished off with a cheesy breadcrumb topping that always ended up extra crispy. You could tell this came from a time when convenience and flavor had to shake hands in a hurry. Moms loved it because it used shelf-stable pantry staples. And in a lot of kitchens across small-town America, it was. But if you think that was comfort food turned up to 11, just wait until you hear about the next one, a dish that was practically designed to stretch $1 and fill a table. Mock turtle soup is something that I'm dead sure you would not have seen coming. See, it's something that came out of 18th century England as a substitute for real turtle soup, which, by the way, was insanely popular in these times. People used to actually consider it something of a delicacy. During the Georgian and Victorian eras, green turtle soup would have sea turtles in it, and it was an incredibly prized dish popular among the local aristocracy. Before you crack a nice little cutting-edge joke about how British cuisine is the strangest thing on the planet, this was also popular in American high society, and it's something that got us through the Depression. That's right, mock turtle soup was something that people would make as much as they could when real turtles weren't around or were too expensive. Now, real turtle meat is known for having an incredibly rich and gelatinous broth. The key to mock turtle soup was just to start with the head of a calf or an oxtail, boil it down with a blend of vegetables like carrots, celery and onions and a spice rub, and slow cooking it. Next, once all the natural collagen was extracted, people would usually add in wine or sherry or Madeira, and this was really common in traditional turtle soup. It replicates the texture of the actual turtle meat, and cooks would try very hard to get that down right. It's one of the most interesting pieces of mock food culture we have, and it shows how good people got at imitating different kinds of foods without the core ingredients. Ground beef and wild mustard greens. Stir-fry was the kind of meal that showed up fast and disappeared even faster. This was not some high-end stir-fry piled with expensive sauces either. It was a down-home skillet sizzler made with ground beef cooked hot and fast, tossed with handfuls of peppery wild mustard greens, plucked fresh from wherever you could find them. Those greens had bite, real bite, and they gave the beef this sharp, earthy pop that plain old spinach could only dream of. A splash of vinegar, a sprinkle of salt, and maybe a little bacon grease if you had it lying around, and you had a dish that punched way above its weight. It was light enough for summer, hearty enough for winter, and cheap enough to keep families fed when money was just a rumor. Stir-fries like these were the ultimate in practical magic, a fast meal that felt like you had been planning it all day. And if you thought a pile of spicy greens and sizzling beef was as good as it gets, just wait until you bite into a crispy pocket filled with beef and roasted roots, the kind of thing great-grandma used to make when the nights got cold. Shipwreck casserole had a name that made you curious and a flavor that made you stay. No one really knows where the name came from. Some say it is because it used whatever ingredients survived in the pantry. Others say it is just what happened to your kitchen when you made it. But if you were growing up in the 1960s or 1970s, you probably saw this show up on your plate more than once. Ground beef was the anchor, and from there, things got creative. Potatoes, sliced thin or cubed chunky, laid the foundation. Rice, usually the minute kind, came in next. Then canned tomatoes, the workhorse of every budget-friendly meal, tied it all together in a bubbling, slightly tangy mix that somehow always hit the spot. And if you think that is resourceful, wait until you see what happened when people tried to make steak rolls without the steak. Beef stuffed donuts are a really bizarre thing to think about. They actually have been a part of tradition for so long. What tradition, you might ask? Well, savory fried dough dishes have been pretty consistently popular across America, believe it or not. Just look at all the meat pies we have. Unlike today's sweet donuts topped with chocolate frosting and red velvet, though, these were a popular way to make some portable food that also filled you up. Different versions of meat-filled fried donuts looked like beef mixed with onions and garlic, or gravy, or even cheese on the inside. So why did something so good disappear? Well, it's just hard to keep up with all the different things the world had to offer. Pre-packaged donuts, frozen ones, ready-made baked goods, all of it meant that people were far less interested in doing basic home baking the usual. Nowadays even, if someone does want to get cooking, they usually think about something that can at least get a couple of views. When it comes to the kind of food that could bring a whole community together, nothing beats a Pow-wow taco skillet. Picture this: golden fry bread sizzling in a cast iron skillet, layered with spiced ground beef, beans, and a sprinkle of sharp cheddar. It is hearty, it is filling, and it is the kind of thing you could smell from half a mile away at a summer fairground. The best part was how everyone had their own little twist. Some would add green chilies, others would pile on diced tomatoes and shredded lettuce. No matter how you stacked it, it was one of those meals where you needed both hands and a whole lot of napkins. It was a festival favorite that always found its way back to the dinner table at home, whether or not there was a real powwow happening. Trust me, once you tried it, no ordinary taco could ever compete. But if you thought the skillet was the ultimate party trick, wait until you see what folks were flipping onto backyard grills during family gatherings. Sloppy Joe pie was what happened when someone decided that sloppy joes deserved a throne. You started with the classic filling: ground beef, tomato sauce or ketchup, a hint of mustard or Worcestershire if you were feeling adventurous, all simmered until it thickened into that perfect sweet, savory sloppy joe consistency. But instead of sandwiching it in a soft bun, you would pour it into a casserole dish and crown it with a golden biscuit crust. Sometimes it was homemade dough, sometimes it was straight from a can, but it always rose into a fluffy, buttery topping that made the whole dish feel complete. Some versions used cornbread instead, which gave it a southern twist with just the right amount of sweetness. And even though it was born in a time when ground beef ruled the dinner table, Sloppy Joe pie had enough personality to still turn heads today. But if you thought ground beef had done it all, just wait until you meet the recipe that turned soda pop into secret sauce. Meat Jell-O, or more commonly known as aspic, is one of the best creations to ever come out of Western culinary history. In this entire list, we have a growing pattern of people mixing gelatinous textures alongside sweet and savory flavors, and this dish was arguably the ultimate culmination of that entire trend. So aspic was actually something that people usually associated with fine dining. It was also used to encase these fancy poached meats, which were sometimes imported, plus the thing just looked really fancy. Starts to make sense when you think about it. The early 20th century saw it turning into more of a generalized thing, though. The bizarre evolution of meat Jell-O was really defined by commercialized powdered gelatin and canned soups, which meant that home cooks now had all the tools they needed to make as many aspic-based wonders as they wanted. It's still pretty hot today, comparatively. Nostalgic beef and sweet corn fry casserole was the dish that looked like a mess but tasted like a memory. Imagine browned ground beef bubbling under a thick layer of golden sweet corn kernels, all tied together with a few shakes of salt and pepper and a little bit of cream if you had it. Baked until the top got crispy and the edges turned caramel brown, it was the kind of casserole that made the whole house smell like comfort. In the 1970s, every family potluck or backyard gathering had at least one version of it, usually scribbled onto a crumpled index card or passed down by word of mouth. Sweet corn was cheap, beef was precious, and when you married the two together, you got a dish that somehow managed to feel luxurious, even when times were lean. The first spoonful always hit you with that sweet, salty magic, and before you knew it, you were scraping the sides of the pan for just one more bite. And if you thought this casserole was the gold standard of hearty, simple eats, just wait until you dive into a beef and hominy masterpiece that practically invented stick-to-your-ribs cooking. Wartime ration hash was not glamorous. It did not pretend to be. But in homes across America during the 1940s, it was dinner, and often a lifesaver. This dish was the ultimate answer to food rationing and meat shortages. You would take whatever you had, maybe a handful of ground beef, a bruised potato, a few limp carrots, and you made it work. Breadcrumbs or oats were added to stretch the beef as far as it could possibly go. Sometimes there were bits of canned green beans or peas tossed in, and if you were lucky, an egg to bind it all together. Everything went into a pan and got crisped until the edges browned and the bottom stuck just a bit to the skillet. Flavor gold, right there. It taught families how to use every last crumb, and it gave a warm, filling meal when the world felt cold and uncertain. But when times got a little better and people had a bit more to spend, things got saucier, cheesier, and a whole lot more comforting. Savory beefcake is a lot lesser known, but its significance in history can't be understated. This is also one of the few items we have that actually dates back to the Victorian era. Back then, meat-based puddings were all the rage alongside sweat cakes. These were really dense cakes that were filled to the brim with protein. They had shredded beef, eggs, ground beef, and sweat or lard, and it made for a very dense, compact loaf, and some versions decided to take it up a few notches more. They would throw in warm spices, gravy, and mushroom stock, give this dish an earthy umami flavor with some sweet undertones. It was particularly beloved in rural households and working-class families simply because it was extremely hard to finish. Not because the dish tasted bad or anything, but it was just that filling. Savory beefcake declined by the 20th century because most people were starting to focus on lighter dishes, but for long journeys where you need something that really fills you up, traditional cedar-smoked beef skewers were one of those dishes that proved you did not need 1,000 ingredients to create something unforgettable. Beef was marinated with just salt, pepper, and maybe a brush of honey if you were feeling wild, then threaded onto wooden sticks and slow roasted over cedar branches. The cedar smoke wrapped itself around the beef, sinking deep into every fiber, turning a simple skewer into a feast that could make even the grumpiest neighbor smile. You would find folks gathered around fire pits, laughing and trading stories while keeping an eye on their skewers, turning them every so often to get that perfect even char. There was something about the smell of cedar smoke that felt like a hug from nature itself, especially when it meant that dinner was almost ready. Kids would sneak bites straight off the sticks, adults would pile them high on plates, and nobody ever left hungry. And if you thought cedar smoke could work miracles on plain beef, wait until you see how mustard greens and ground beef teamed up for one of the most overlooked flavor combos in history. If you think about it, pickled beef balls were really just as old-fashioned. They were born out of a preservation technique that basically combined chopped beef with vinegar, salt, and some spices that were then cured in a briny liquid. This was done so that the meat would last a lot longer than it usually could, and it was likely something that came out of pickled meat traditions stemming from Europe. German Sauerfleisch and the Jewish dish pickled tongue have some pretty strong resemblance to this dish. The acidity of the vinegar would do more than just preserve the meat. It would also be wonderful at tenderizing the meat so that you could actually use cheaper cuts of meat. Most rural families could not afford premium cuts because of how expensive they were, but nobody really liked eating chewy, tough, rubber-like meat. These pickled beef balls were an easy solution, and one that you could make in a batch for a rainy day. Some of these meals held entire families together on nothing but a pound of beef and a little imagination. Which one takes you back to that kitchen?